Her characters eat and laugh and cry and work and kill. They swing like a pendulum eternally in that safe and narrow orbit in which America likes to see the Negro live, between laughter and tears. The sensory sweep of her novel carries no theme, no message, no thought. In the main, her novel is not addressed to the Negro, but to a white audience whose chauvinistic taste she knows how to satisfy. She exploits the phase of Negro life which is quaint, the phase which evokes a piteous smile on the lips of the superior race.
There was also an attack from Alan Locke, Hurston's former teacher and early supporter, the same editor who had published her first short story, Spunk. His words had to cut Hurston particularly deep. Writing an opportunity, he posed to her,
"When will the Negro novelist of maturity come to grips with motive fiction and social document fiction? Progressive Southern fiction has already banished the legend of these entertaining pseudo-primitives whom the reading public still loves to laugh with, weep over, and envy. Having gotten rid of condescension, let us now get over oversimplification."
Why would someone like Hurston, obviously a respected and established artist with extraordinary literary talent, gamble with her literary career in such a cavalier fashion? Why would she continue to thumb her nose at the most respected and powerful leaders in the African American community? And perhaps, most importantly, why would she deliberately challenge the collective voice, cultural identity, and political unity of the Harlem Renaissance? Historians have long speculated that the Black elite and many of Hurston's contemporaries may not have fully considered her unique upbringing. Her counterculture positioning was probably established long before she first came to New York City. By growing up in an all-Black and historic town of Eatonville, Florida, a place where her father had served as mayor and all the town officials and community pillars were Black, Hurston was spared the typical view of a racially charged and segregated South. Hurston was not, as most historians believe, indoctrinated in racial inferiority to the degree that most of her contemporaries might have been.
If you're a Black woman or a Black person of any gender in the United States of America in the first 50 or so years of the 20th century, you're going to encounter segregation, you're going to encounter racism, you're going to encounter what you could call the race problem.
Robert Hemingway.
But Hurston's point was that there's so much more to life as a Black person than just the race problem. And that's the way whites tend to define Black people, tend to define Black people in terms of what's their position on the race problem, how are they interacting with the white world. Hurston was less interested in how somebody was interacting with the white world than she was in how people were just plain living their lives. Hurston was writing about the Black community from within. She wasn't writing protest, as some Black writers at the time were doing. And the conflicts that she ran into about her own work tended to be conflicts over why wasn't she writing a protest novel like Richard Wright's Native Son, or why was she just talking about people having a good time when we're living in a country where full citizenship rights to Black people are being denied, where Black people in the South could lose their lives if they impacted on the white community in the wrong way.
Hemingway also notes that Hurston was the only major writer who had come directly from the South and had brought an extra dimension to the Renaissance. Her ability to remain authentic to what she considered representative of her native culture, with blatant public insouciance, and despite the growing wave of conformity, is indeed profound. Criticism couldn't manage to tame her. Hurston continued collecting folklore, writing and publishing books, and staging and producing Broadway plays based on her folklore. She collaborated with Langston Hughes to write and produce the play Mulebone. However, creative differences and ownership issues would later cripple their close friendship and prevent the play from being performed during their lifetime. Hurston also joined other Renaissance mavericks to produce a rebellious, avant-garde magazine they called Fire. The magazine featured stories and poetry the more progressive literary outlets had rejected. It only lasted one issue. Facing controversy and opposition at almost every turn, Hurston remained prolific and dedicated to her work. Carla Kaplan.
Hurston had put herself at the center of much of what was going on in American culture, and in African American culture specifically. She went through each of the activities that she dedicated her time to by breaking the rules and doing things slightly askew of the way everybody else was doing them. Among them was constant criticism of the Black leadership of the Harlem Renaissance, the Black leadership of the 1930s, and indeed she was constantly critical of the very people who could help her career and who were her good friends. She wrote one letter, for example, to James Weldon Johnson, in which she described Elaine Leroy Locke, known as the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance, as a spiteful little snot. She also, during this same period, created a rather unfortunate nickname for W.E.B. Du Bois, and she called him in print and in public Dr. Dubious. Some of these criticisms of the Black leadership and of her friends would come back to haunt her, particularly in the 1940s.
Hurston's literary representations of rural Southern culture, however authentic, artistic, lyrical, and beautifully represented, had a profound effect on her personal and professional life. She left New York in 1950 after false charges of child molestation against her were dropped. She contemplated suicide and quickly moved back to Florida. She wrote a number of controversial essays and found it hard to keep a job, even as a domestic. Her books were soon out of print, all subsequent manuscripts were rejected, and she suffered for many years in financial and physical destitution. Her uncelebrated death in 1960 seemed to signify her place in permanent obscurity. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Fort Pierce, Florida. However, this is not the end of Zora Neale Hurston's incredible story. In our final segment, we recount her last years in Florida, her uncelebrated death, and ultimately the birth of Zora-mania, a spectacular resurrection of her work and cultural iconicity, led by fellow Southern writer and author of The Color Purple, Alice Walker. I'm Vanessa Williams, and you're listening to The Life and Times of Zora Neale Hurston from Public Radio International. As the Great Depression took grip of the United States during the 1930s, the desolation cemented the end of the Renaissance, as interest in, the creation of, and the support for such art dissipated. Most of the writers and artists associated with the movement, including Countee Cullen, Jessie Faust, and Nella Lawson, went back to the classroom, their creative output thwarted. Almost everyone except Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston gave up on art as a profession. Hurston's commitment to continue writing was a great sacrifice, both financially and politically. Yet she moved headstrong into one project after another, and always with the same goal: Carla Kaplan.
In the 1940s, she continued to come up with really interesting schemes to document and represent the beauty and the significance of Black culture and Black history. In fact, at one point in the 1940s, she tried to raise a sunken slave ship called the Clotilde. Unfortunately, it was capped off in 1948 by a true personal tragedy. In 1948, Zora Neale Hurston was traveling in Honduras. She was on an expedition to discover what she thought would be a lost Mayan village. While she was gone, a former landlady of hers, who she had clearly angered, decided to take revenge on Hurston by accusing her of having sexually molested her 10-year-old son. The story got out into the Black press. It was an enormous headline. Hurston was humiliated nationally by being accused of a sex crime. She was arrested for this crime. She was thrown in jail overnight. She was absolutely devastated, both by the betrayal in the Black press and by the humiliation of being accused of something so unthinkable as molesting a child. She became suicidal. She wrote a suicide note to her dear friends Carl Van Vechten and Fania Marinoff. Her lawyer got her out of jail, and she was able to document clearly that she couldn't have committed this crime because she was in Honduras, as her passport clearly showed. But she was devastated by having been humiliated in the national press, and she disappeared. For a period of many months, she completely vanished from the public record. I was able to discover that she went back into Florida, a place that had always sustained and nurtured her.
Gone were the days of Black Vogue and the flood of Black artistic expression and publishing that signified the height of the Harlem Renaissance. Although Hurston by this time had published 7 books, she found the same industry no longer willing to embrace her work. There is evidence of at least 2 novels that were rejected: The Lives of Barney Turk, a story about African Americans in Hollywood, and The Golden Bench of God, which was to be Hurston's life story of Madam C.J. Walker, the first African American entrepreneur to earn $1 million. Both manuscripts have been lost. Periodically, Hurston was able to publish her essays in various Black newspapers, but these efforts were routinely met with astounding criticism. One of the most controversial of these expressed her position on integration: Cheryl Wall.
Hurston had found herself, I think, out of sync with the leaders of African Americans at the time. She had expressed real impatience with the move towards integration because she believed, for example, the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, rather than a victory, which is certainly the way that most African American leaders, and I would say most African Americans, believed it to be. Hurston saw it as in part an insult because it seemed to move from the premise that Black people needed to be in schools and in institutions with white people in order to succeed. The experiences of Hurston's life had suggested otherwise. Eatonville had been a very good place to grow up and had given her a sense of self that she would not have perhaps developed had she been in an integrated community. So Hurston was really isolated ideologically, she was isolated artistically, and she was flat broke.